Somewhere tonight a fire is burning. Maybe it's winter where you are, frost pressed against the glass, the kind of cold that makes a warm room feel like a gift. Or maybe it's deep into a summer night, and the heat outside finally broke an hour ago, and you found a quiet corner to settle into before sleep. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, pull up a bench. This is the tavern, and the night is just getting started. Picture the room. Low beams darkened by years of smoke, rushes scattered across a stone floor, tallow candles guttering in iron holders along the walls. The fire in the great hearth throws long shadows that shift and breathe with every draught from the door. Someone is laughing at a table near the back. A dog is asleep under a bench. Mugs are full. The smell of wood smoke and roasted meat hangs in the air like something permanent, something that was here before any of these people arrived and will linger long after they're gone. And there, near the fire, a figure is tuning a harp. He hasn't started yet. He's adjusting a peg, tilting his head to listen to the string, running a thumb lightly across 3 or 4 notes to check how they sit against each other. The room hasn't gone quiet for him. Not yet. He's patient. He's done this before. He's done this, you might say, his entire life. And in another sense, so have the people who came before him. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you are right now and what time it is. Morning in Tokyo, midnight in Berlin, 3 in the afternoon in a city that gets dark early. There is something genuinely remarkable about the fact that a room like this one, built of nothing but words and firelight, can hold people from every corner of the world at the same moment. That's not a small thing. The bard by the fire would have found it astonishing. We shouldn't take it for granted either. Now, about that bard. The figure we're imagining tonight is a composite, and it's worth being honest about that from the start. In the strictest historical sense, a bard was a Celtic specialist, a professional poet and musician, attached to a noble household in Ireland, Wales, or ancient Britain. The Oxford English Dictionary describes the role with real precision, composing and singing verses to the harp, preserving historical and traditional facts, laws, genealogies, the deeds of chiefs and warriors. In early Celtic societies, which relied far more on oral transmission than on written records, the bard functioned as a living archive. Memory was not metaphor. It was the actual storage system. Lose the bard and you lose the lineage. You lose the lore. You lose the version of events your house needs people to believe. That's a different kind of performer than the wandering entertainer of tavern fantasy, and it's worth knowing the difference. The troubadours of southern France, the jongleurs who moved between markets and inns, the Norse skalds composing intricate praise poetry for chieftains across the North Atlantic. Each of these traditions was distinct, shaped by different cultures and different pressures. What we call a bard tonight is, truthfully, all of them compressed into one figure, the way a prism compresses light. A useful shorthand, a composite built from centuries of real practice. What all of them shared was the chain. Each performer inherited stories from someone before them, reshaped those stories to fit a new audience, a new moment, a new political climate or collective fear, and then passed the altered version on again. Ancient Greek rhapsodes. The word means something close to song stitchers, travelled between festivals reciting and adapting epic narratives that linked communities to their mythological past. They were not simply memorising fixed texts. They were active participants in a living tradition. So were Celtic bards. So were the medieval minstrels who carried news and legend between towns that had no other way to learn what the wider world was doing. And so, in a way that would have confused any of them, are the storytellers who sit down tonight in front of a camera or a microphone and reach across an invisible network to find you in your corner of the world. Tonight's bard is part of that chain. He doesn't know it stretches forward as far as it does, but he knows it stretches back a long way. What he's going to give you tonight is a collection of legends, stories you may have heard pieces of before, in very different forms. Arthur. A voyage to an island beyond ordinary reach. A warrior queen from a land so distant it seemed almost impossible. A catastrophic flood that swallowed a city whole. These are old stories. They carry weight, but they also carry questions that scholars and archaeologists are still turning over, still arguing about, still finding new evidence to complicate. Some of these tales have a dozen versions. None of them has a single true one. He knows that. You should know it too going in. The room is settling now. Conversations are dropping to a murmur. Someone sets down a mug. He plays the first notes of something old. The string he just played rings in the air a moment longer than you'd expect. That's the harp for you. It doesn't let go of a note cleanly. It holds on, lets it dissolve slowly, the way a good story lingers after the last word. He adjusts one more peg, listens, nods to himself. Here is what he is, and here is what he isn't. In the world this tavern is drawn from, the figure sitting near your hearth might have been any one of several distinct traditions. A Celtic bard, and the word itself comes through Old Welsh and Irish, rooted in something meaning to praise, was not primarily an entertainer. He was a specialist, trained for years, sometimes a decade or more, attached to a noble household where his primary currency was memory, genealogy, lore encoded in verse because verse was easier to remember accurately than plain speech. The deeds of lords and ancestors shaped into forms that people could carry in their heads across generations. In early Irish tradition, the file, the highest order of poet, held legal standing. A satire composed by a skilled poet could damage a ruler's reputation in ways that lasted. Praise poetry wasn't flattery. It was a political instrument, a public record, a claim staked in the hearing of witnesses. Norse skalds operated under similar pressures, though in a different key. From roughly the 9th through the 13th centuries, court poets across Scandinavia and Iceland composed in a form called drottkvet, an intricate, demanding metre with internal rhymes and complex kennings, figurative compounds that wrapped a simple concept in layers of reference. The sea was the whale road, gold was fire of the sea, a ruler's generosity became the snow of the hand. These weren't decorations, they were demonstrations. A skald who could hold that structure together while praising a king's battle courage in front of that king's warriors was proving something with every line. Intelligence, control, loyalty. The sagas record at least one instance where a well-timed poem actually softened a death sentence. That is not a small social power. Meanwhile, further south and a few centuries later, the troubadours of Occitania, what we'd now call southern France, were a different creature again. Many of them were of noble birth, composing lyric verse in Old Occitan on themes of chivalry and courtly love, a form of desire that was almost always idealized, often politically coded, and sometimes performed not by the composer himself, but by a jongleur or minstrel, a working entertainer lower on the social ladder who carried the poem to audiences the original composer might never meet. That gap between the elite poet and the travelling performer is one the modern fantasy image tends to collapse entirely. And then there is the minstrel, the most tavern-familiar of the group. Medieval European minstrels were often itinerant, moving between courts, market squares, and exactly the kind of inn you're sitting in now. They sang, played fiddle or harp or later lute, sometimes juggled, sometimes carried news from town to town in a world with no other mechanism for spreading it. They were the closest historical equivalent to what our bard tonight represents. They were also often the lowest status of the bunch. The court poet had a patron, a position, a home. The minstrel had the road and whatever the room would give him. What all of these figures actually shared in practice was something quieter than their legends suggest. A small harp being tuned between verses. A pause stretched deliberately while a room settled. Eyes tracking the far corner where someone seemed restless, or the table near the door where a new group had just come in and might need the story adjusted. Shorter, lighter, better suited to strangers who hadn't been there for the beginning. Performance was responsive. It was a conversation even when only one person was speaking. And here is the honest caveat that sits beneath all of this. Much of what we know about early bardic life was written down long after the oral tradition it describes had already changed, sometimes beyond recognition. The Romantics of the 18th and 19th centuries loved the idea of ancient bardic culture. They loved it so much that in some cases they invented parts of it. A Scotsman named James Macpherson published what he claimed were ancient Gaelic epic poems by a bard called Ossian in the 1760s. Scholars argued bitterly about their authenticity for decades. The truth turned out to be complicated. Some genuine fragments, much elaboration, some outright fabrication. The poems were immensely influential and spread a romantic vision of bardic antiquity across Europe. They were also, in significant part, a fraud. That is the tradition working on itself, reshaping its own past exactly as it always had, just with a more modern kind of ambition attached. So when you look at what we now call the fantasy bard, the charismatic lute wielder in the tavern corner, who can charm a crowd or cast magic through song, whose role was crystallized most cleanly by a certain well-known role-playing game, you are looking at a genuine cultural creation, but not a historical one. It is Celtic bard collapsed into Norse skald, collapsed into Occitan troubadour, collapsed into wandering minstrel, with some ancient Greek rhapsode mixed in somewhere, all compressed into one figure carrying a lute and a knowing smile. Each of those originals was real. None of them was quite that. The man by your fire knows this roughly. He's thought about it more than you might expect. He isn't claiming to be something ancient and pure. He's claiming to be one link in a chain that started before either of you were born and will continue after tonight's fire goes out. What he knows, he learned from someone. What that someone knew, they inherited in turn, reshaped along the way to fit an audience that no longer exists in a world that has changed completely. He's not a perfect vessel, he's a working one, and that, he would tell you if you asked, is exactly what you should want. He sets his hands against the strings. He begins without announcing it. The first notes are low, deliberate, something that feels like open country or the memory of it. Then his voice comes in, and the room shifts its weight, leaning slightly toward the source without anyone quite deciding to. A king, he says, or something like a king. A man who held a crumbling island together by will and sword when the empire that had held it before finally let go. He doesn't set a scene so much as drop you inside one. A hall somewhere in the west of Britain, stone, firelight, men who had grown up speaking Latin and now had to decide who they were without Rome to tell them. A sword drawn from something, he says with a small smile, because the story takes many shapes depending on who is telling it and when. A court gathered not just to feast, but to hold a claim. That order was still possible, that the darkness pressing in from the eastern coast could be pushed back, that the world they had been born into wasn't finished yet. The room is quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has caught them. He lets the melody rest. Here is what I'll tell you plainly, he says, dropping slightly out of the song and into the space between storytelling and conversation that the best performers have always occupied. The man called Arthur, if there was such a man, is one of the most examined figures in all the history of legend. Scholars have been turning over that ground for centuries, and the honest answer, the one that doesn't make for a tidy ending, is that we don't know. We genuinely, carefully, rigorously don't know. What we do know is this. Britain in the late 5th and early 6th centuries was a fractured place. The Roman legions had withdrawn by the early 400s, leaving behind a society that had organised itself around Roman administration for nearly 400 years. Into that vacuum came pressure from multiple directions. Angles and Saxons crossing the North Sea, Picts pressing from the north, internal divisions pulling at whatever remained. And there is evidence, fragmentary but real, of resistance, of someone or someones holding ground. A monk called Gildas, writing in the 6th century, close enough to the events to matter, describes a great British victory at a place called Mons Badonicus, Baden Hill. He calls it the last almost ruinous conquest of the villains. A real battle, it seems, a genuine turning point in the pressure on British territory, if only temporarily. Scholars debate the date, somewhere around 500, give or take a generation depending on how you read the available clues, but the event itself appears in the record. Gildas never mentions Arthur, not once. Arthur enters the written record later, and already mythologized. A 9th century Welsh text, the Historia Brittonum lists him not as a king, but as a war leader, a dux bellorum, fighting alongside kings rather than above them, and credits him with 12 victories including Baden. By the time the Annales Cambrium, the Welsh annals, were compiled in their surviving form, they offered 2 terse entries. Baden, where Arthur supposedly carried the cross of Christ on his shoulders for 3 days, and Camlan, where Arthur and a man named Medrout fell. No elaboration, just the names, the dates, themselves uncertain reconstructions, and the silence of a record that is already much later than the events it claims to preserve. The gap between any possible historical kernel and the written tradition is enormous. Generations of oral transmission, reshaping, political need, religious interpretation, all working on the material before a single monk set stylus to wax. And then Geoffrey of Monmouth arrived. Writing around 1135, Geoffrey produced his Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain, and what he did to Arthur was, depending on your perspective, either an act of magnificent creative synthesis or an act of cheerful invention dressed as history. Probably both. He gave Arthur a grand court. He gave him European conquests, a betrayal by a kinsman, a final wound at Camlan, and then something that no purely historical figure gets, a departure to the Isle of Avalon, with the explicit promise that he would return when Britain needed him most. That promise is the structural heart of why Arthur matters so much, and why courts and poets and ordinary people held on to him so fiercely for so long. He doesn't die. He waits. Think about what that means in context, the bard says, setting his thumb against the strings again without quite playing yet. You're living in a world that has recently lost the framework that organised it for 4 centuries. The roads still run, the walls still stand in places, but the authority that built them is gone. You're improvising your civilization out of the wreckage of someone else's. Into that situation, the story offers you a king who hasn't abandoned you, who is merely sleeping, who will come back when the need is great enough. That is not mythology for its own sake. That is a community using story to maintain hope against the evidence of collapse. And courts loved it for a different reason too. If you were a medieval ruler claiming legitimacy over a difficult island with a complex ethnic past, aligning yourself with Arthur was a form of political argument. The Welsh used him. The Normans, after 1066, began to use him. Even the monarchy in England would eventually find ways to place themselves in Arthurian context. The legend was not static decoration. It was a living political instrument, repurposed by each generation for its immediate needs. The French had their own thoughts about what to do with him. By the late 12th century, a poet named Chrétien de Troyes was writing in Old French, and Arthur's court had transformed into something substantially different. Less a desperate post-Roman fortress, more a glittering stage for chivalric ideals and courtly love. Chrétien introduced Lancelot. He gestured tantalizingly at a sacred vessel, a quest of spiritual purification. In the sprawling prose cycles that followed in the 13th century, the vast Lancelot Grail sequence, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival in German, Arthur's world became a lens for examining human failure in the face of the divine. The Round Table is a vision of perfect order. The Grail quest is the thing that Table cannot ultimately achieve. The court that destroys itself not through external attack, but through the weight of its own interior fractures. The tragedy deepened. The spiritual stakes rose. The original warlord of sub-Roman Britain had become the patron saint of an entire civilization's anxieties about whether nobility was possible at all. He plays a few notes, low and unresolved. What lies under all of it, he says, is something more modest and perhaps more moving than the grand legend that grew around it. A people who had organized their world in one way and suddenly had to build something new from the ruins, who looked at what remained, the stones, the roads, the memory of lore, and tried to make a story out of the wreckage that honoured what had been lost without pretending it was still there. Who needed a king who might return because the world they could actually see offered no guarantees at all? Whether Arthur was a real man, one man or several, a title rather than a name, a composite of victories told and retold until they cohered into a single figure, we cannot say with confidence. The historians are careful about this, and careful is the right word. But the longing is real. That much the record preserves without ambiguity. He holds the final chord a moment, lets the room breathe around it. That, he says quietly, is where all the great ones start. The strings settle into something almost still. He turns the instrument slightly in his hands, not playing, just thinking, or giving the impression of thinking, which in a good performer amounts to the same thing. Here is what I find interesting about Arthur, he says, and his voice drops to the register he uses when he is speaking to you rather than to the room. Not the legend, the gap between the legend and the evidence, because that gap is wider than most people realise and stranger, and in its own way more fascinating than any sword in any stone. Start with the sources. Historians are not sceptical about Arthur out of stubbornness or a failure of imagination. They are sceptical because the written record is genuinely, almost startlingly thin, and most of it arrives late. Gildas, writing somewhere around 540, is the closest we have to a contemporary voice for the period when Arthur is supposed to have lived. He describes Baden. He describes the British resistance to Saxon pressure in terms vivid enough to suggest he understood what was at stake. And he names names. He's not shy about naming names, especially when he wants to criticise someone. But Arthur is not among them. The name simply does not appear. That silence is not proof of anything, but it is not nothing either. The next substantial chronicle is Bede, writing in 731, nearly 2 centuries after the events in question. He covers the Anglo-Saxon incursions in considerable detail, drawing partly on Gildas. Still no Arthur. Then comes the Historia Brittonum, compiled in the early 9th century and attributed to a Welsh scholar named Nennius, though the attribution itself is disputed and the text shows clear signs of multiple hands working over time. This is the first document to actually name Arthur in a military context, and when it does, it presents him not as a king but as a war leader, a dux bellorum, a leader of battles, fighting alongside kings rather than over them. 12 victories are listed, Bardon among them. That text was compiled roughly 300 to 400 years after the battles it describes. To put that in proportion, imagine someone writing today about events from the 14th century, drawing on earlier documents that were themselves already summaries and revisions of older oral tradition. What you would have, however sincere, is not a direct record. It is the archaeology of memory, and the layers have mixed. The Annales Cambri, the Welsh Annals, add 2 brief entries. Baden, where Arthur supposedly carried the cross of Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and nights, and Camlan, where Arthur and Medraut fell together. These entries, in their surviving form, were compiled perhaps 400 to 450 years after the supposed events. The compiler appears to have been working from earlier notes, but tracing exactly what those notes said and where they came from is extraordinarily difficult. Scholars have been arguing the details for decades, and the arguments have not resolved. What this means, practically, is that the rich and detailed Arthur, the High King, the Round Table, Excalibur drawn from stone or water depending on the telling, Merlin, Guinevere, Lancelot, the whole elaborate architecture, comes almost entirely from Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 1130s. Geoffrey was working about 600 years after the events he claimed to be recording. He was, by all evidence, a brilliant synthesizer and a very creative man, and his Historia Regum Britannia changed everything about how later generations understood Arthur. But it is not, in any recognisable sense, a historical document. It is something closer to what we might now call historical fiction, except that Geoffrey seems to have believed, or wanted his readers to believe, that it was more than that. The medieval romances that followed, Chrétien de Troyes, the vast Lancelot Grail cycles, Malory's Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, built on Geoffrey rather than on independent tradition. Each edition felt authoritative because it drew on what had come before, but what had come before was already substantially invented. The Arthur that feels most ancient to modern audiences is, in many cases, a product of the 12th and 13th centuries at the earliest, and sometimes the 19th. That last point deserves to breathe for a moment. Some of what feels most deeply, instinctively old about certain legends is actually quite recent. The Romantics of the 18th and 19th centuries had a particular talent for writing material that vibrated at the frequency of antiquity. Alfred Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King, published between 1859 and 1885, shaped the popular image of Camelot for the entire English-speaking world. His Arthur is noble, tragic, Christian, chivalric, and feels as though he has always existed in exactly that form. He is not. He is a Victorian construction draped over medieval material, draped over something much older and far less certain. Knowing that does not diminish the poetry. It just changes what the poetry is. There is a lesson in that, the bard says, running his thumb lightly across the strings. Every age calls up the Arthur it needs. The Welsh in the early medieval period needed a hero of resistance, a sign that British identity had not been extinguished. The Norman and Plantagenet courts needed a legitimising mythology that could paper over conquest with something more flattering. The Victorians needed a moral exemplar, a counter-image to what industrialisation was doing to their sense of the past. And in all of this reshaping, each version felt to its audience like the real one, the one that had always existed, the one the others had merely obscured. That is not manipulation, or not always. It is simply how legends work. They are adaptive structures. They survive by remaining useful. Archaeology offers something quieter and more grounded. Cadbury Castle in Somerset, a hill fort long associated in local tradition with Camelot, shows clear evidence of significant refortification in the 5th and 6th centuries. Someone with substantial resources was using that site in exactly the period when Arthur is supposed to have operated. At Tintagel in Cornwall, a high-status settlement from the same era, excavators found an inscribed stone bearing a name that appears to be a variant of Artonu. Not Arthur, not a king, but a name from the right place and the right time, connected to power and literacy in a period when both were scarce. Nothing in either place can be tied securely to a man named Arthur. But both places confirm that powerful, organised Brittonic elites existed during those centuries, that they built things, defended things, and left marks on the landscape. The atmosphere is preserved, even when the specific figure is not. That is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about what lies behind Arthur. The legend remembers the crisis accurately even when it cannot remember the names. A fractured post-Roman island, real resistance, real loss, real longing for a leader who could hold the pieces together. All of that is genuinely there in the historical record. The story grew to fill a shape that the history had left behind. He shifts his weight on the bench, and the fire beside him pops once, orange light jumping briefly across the ceiling. And honestly, he says, with something that might be a smile, the uncertainty makes it better. A fully documented Arthur. Birth certificate, tax records, a reliable account of the final battle, would be a historical figure. Interesting, certainly. But the Arthur who may or may not have existed, who may have been one man or several, whose name attached itself to victories that needed a hero and refused to let go, that Arthur can hold something that no documented person quite can. He can hold possibility. You're still in the tavern. The fire is still warm. The questions are still open. He sets his fingers back to the strings. The song begins before he announces it. A single low note, held, then another beneath it. The two strings tuned to something that sits just outside comfort, not quite dissonant, not quite resolved. Several people near the fire look up from their cups without meaning to. That is the point, of course. A skilled performer knows how to reframe the air in a room before a word has been spoken. When he does speak, it is low and even, and the words come in waves that have the rhythm of water, even when they aren't describing it. There was a sailor, he says, who rowed west until the fog ate the stars. He had a crew of 17, some cousins, some men who owed him a debt. One monk who claimed the voyage had been ordered by an angel, and who the others tolerated because they were uncertain enough about the world to want a man of God on board just in case. They had a leather-hulled boat, dried meat, a bronze bowl for rain, and directions that amounted to, keep the setting sun on your left shoulder until something changes. Something always changes on those voyages. This is the geography of the Celtic Imrama, the voyage tales. And you should know that geography is not metaphorical, even when it is also metaphorical. These are Irish and Welsh stories, recorded largely in medieval manuscripts, but carrying within them motifs and anxieties that feel much older. The westward sea as a threshold, the fog as a membrane between worlds, the island you cannot find twice, even if you once stood on its shore and tasted its fruit. Scholars argue about whether the tradition is primarily pre-Christian Celtic, or whether it was shaped by later monastic writers who grafted Christian pilgrimage theology onto older sea lore, or whether the stories carry memories of actual Atlantic exploration, voyages made, landfalls glimpsed, rumours carried back to harbour towns and embellished through the winter. The honest answer is, probably all three, in proportions that are impossible now to separate. The sailor rowed toward a sound before he could see the island. That was how it worked in these stories. Music came first, birdsong so complex it seemed organised, or a harp note that could not have a source, or simply a silence so complete that it registered in the ear as a kind of tone. Then the mist thinned, and there was light behind it, and the light was wrong, too golden for the hour, too steady for a sky with weather in it. And then the shore, Emen Ablach, the Isle of Apples. The name appears in early Irish tradition, and the trees on this place were not growing so much as offering. Silver branches, blossom and fruit at once, the way nothing grows in any world the sailor had previously inhabited. The air was warm regardless of season. There was no mud, no rot, no livestock smell. People walked there who had no business being alive, and they knew who the sailor was before he gave his name. You can hear Avalon in all of this, and you're not imagining it. The connections between Emen Ablach and the isle to which Arthur is carried at the end of Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, wounded, not dead, placed in a boat taken west, are close enough that most scholars treat them as branches of the same rooted tradition. An island of apples or orchards at the western edge of the sea associated with healing, with time that moves differently than ordinary time, with the slim and fervent hope that someone who was lost is not entirely gone. Whether that island was called by an Irish name or a Welsh one or a Latin one, the emotional logic was identical. The sailor's monk knelt in the boat and prayed. The others simply stared. Here is where the harbours come in, because you cannot have a legend like this without harbour gossip, and harbour gossip is a serious historical force. Sailors talk. They talk in specific sensory terms: the colour of unfamiliar water, the angle of stars that don't match the charts, the shape of a headland seen once in good visibility and lost again in rain. These reports travel. They get repeated by people who were not there, compressed into patterns, attached to earlier stories that already had traction. By 1325, an island called High Brazil was appearing on European maps west of Ireland, appearing so regularly and with such cartographic confidence that it is easy to forget that no one had established coordinates for it with any reliability. Sailors claimed to have seen it, a dark mass through fog, occasionally, briefly. It appeared on maps copied from other maps that had themselves been copied from speculation. The island existed in the documentary record long before anyone could agree on where exactly it was, or whether it was solid ground, or light on the water, or a wish made cartographic. That is harbour gossip becoming myth, becoming official knowledge. It is a very human process. This sailor on the otherworld shore was offered a choice, though the terms were not spelled out clearly. That was the nature of these offers. He could remain, no hunger, no winter, no grief, none of the particular wearing down that constitutes an ordinary life. Or he could return, carrying what he'd seen, and spend the rest of his days trying to describe it to people who had not been there, and who would doubt him even as they listened. Most of the heroes in the Imrama chose to go back. That choice is itself worth sitting with. Because the island in these stories is not simply paradise. It never quite is, even when it resembles paradise closely. It is also exile. A place outside time is also a place outside everything you know. Heroes who stay too long and then try to return find that the world has moved without them, that their names are old names now, that the people who loved them are buried in places they cannot find. There is a grief embedded in the otherworld island that the paradise imagery doesn't quite cover. It is the grief of the sailor who has glimpsed something irretrievable. It is the grief of any generation that suspects it has already missed the age that mattered. And then there is the reading where the island is a warning, where the fog and the unearthly calm and the two golden light are the story's way of saying, this is the cost of seeking something absolute. The sailor who rose toward perfection rose away from the imperfect world where the people he loves are actually living. Multiple readings, all of them present in the same set of images. That is what makes these stories survive. You're still in the tavern. Think about who is in this room with you tonight. There are traders here. Men and women who know the harbour, who have heard enough sailors' stories to build a private geography of the sea's rumours. There are dreamers here, people for whom the idea of a fog-hidden shore is not frightening but magnetic. There may even be someone here who has been to sea, who has watched the horizon until the horizon seemed to move, and who has their own private version of the island they almost saw. All of them are listening. That is the point of the island in the mist. It is not meant to be reached. It is meant to be just visible enough that you cannot stop looking. The bard lets the two low strings fade into each other and into the room's ambient noise, the fire, the weather outside, the distant thunk of someone setting down a heavy cup. Every sea story is also a map, he says, and every map is also a wish. He sets the instrument down for a moment, not dramatically, just resting it against his knee the way a man rests a tool he knows he will pick up again shortly. And he says, with the easy conversational tone of someone who's been thinking about this for a long time, "You know what those maps actually looked like? Not the imagined ones, the real ones, the ones drawn by men who had spoken to sailors, who had read Pliny and Ptolemy, who had access to the accumulated navigational knowledge of centuries. Take the Hereford Mappa Mundi, drawn around 1300. It is a circular world, a disk of known land surrounded by the encircling ocean, and at the edges, where the coastlines stop making confident sense, the map maker placed wonders. Dog-headed people, creatures with one enormous foot they use as a parasol against the sun, sea beasts coiled in the waters off the world's rim, not because the map maker was naive, because the edges of the known world were genuinely unknown, and something had to fill that space, and what filled it was the accumulated weight of classical authority and sailor rumour and honest uncertainty given monstrous form. The bard glances around the room, and there is something quietly conspiratorial in it. Here is the thing about those monsters. Some of them were real. When the Carta Marina was published in 1539, a gorgeous detailed map of the northern seas by a Swedish churchman named Olaus Magnus, it was crawling with creatures, vast whales that could be mistaken for islands, serpents long enough to wrap around a ship's hull. And yes, many of those images were borrowed from earlier maps, which borrowed them from classical texts, which borrowed them from sailors who had possibly borrowed from their own dreams. That is how cartographic monsters worked. They travelled, they copied, they accumulated authority simply by persisting. But walruses are real. All fish are real, and they can reach lengths that, glimpsed from a small boat in poor visibility, become something else entirely. Sperm whales surfacing without warning are real. The dangerous currents off the northern coast are very real. What looks like fantasy on those maps is often navigational intelligence wearing a costume, and the island that submerges, the one that burns or sinks when a sailor lights a fire on it, that story which winds through the legend of St. Brendan's voyage and appears in Magnus's northern accounts, almost certainly has a kernel of experience, not supernatural experience, whale experience. The back of a very large whale, encrusted with debris, motionless in calm water. You can imagine, if you've been at sea for weeks, what you might think you are seeing. He picks up the instrument again, turns a peg slightly, drops it back against his knee. Now, there is something worth clearing up here, and I say it not to diminish the wonder, but to protect it from a worse kind of confusion. Medieval sailors were not afraid of sailing off the edge of a flat world. They were not afraid of this because educated people in medieval Europe did not think the world was flat. By the time the Mappa Mundi was drawn, European scholars had inherited centuries of Greco-Roman understanding of a spherical Earth. Aristotle had argued for it. Eratosthenes had estimated its circumference with impressive accuracy in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Medieval navigators worked with latitude sailing and, from the 14th century onward, with Portolan charts, precise, practical coastal maps made from accumulated compass measurements and sailing distances. The flat earth sailor is a fantasy, but not a medieval one. It was invented in the 19th century, largely by Washington Irving in a colourful but fictional account of Columbus, and it stuck because it made a good story. The truth is more interesting. Sailors of the late Middle Ages were worried about running out of water, about storms, about hostile coasts, about magnetic variation confusing their compasses. Their cosmological model was, in broad strokes, correct. They just didn't know what was west of the ocean's open expanse. That ignorance was real. The sea was genuinely terrifying. And from genuine terror, genuine legend grows. Think about how weather works on the North Atlantic. The fog banks off the Irish coast are not occasional inconveniences. They are enormous, persistent, disorienting systems that can reduce a boat to a small wet world with no horizon and no sky. Currents run in patterns that, without instruments, can carry a vessel sideways without the crew fully understanding what is happening. Iceland is real. The Faroe Islands are real. The Norse were sailing to Greenland and possibly to the coast of North America 5 centuries before Columbus, and their accounts, filtered through the sagas, describe lands at the western edge of the ocean that do not behave the way home behaves. Strange forests, strange peoples, winters that nonetheless have a different quality than Norse winters. These are voyage reports, however embellished, and they fed back into the shared pool of sailor knowledge and become, over generations, the ocean's mythology. What is remarkable is how oral cultures managed this information. There were no databases. There were no formal hydrographic services. What there was, memory and conversation, and the bardic tradition of embedding navigational or geographical knowledge inside narrative that people would actually repeat. A story about a current that pulls ships sideways is harder to remember than a story about a sea serpent that grabs ships sideways. The terror is the same. The lesson survives better in the monstrous form. Maps and rumours and memory working together. That is how it functioned. A sailor returns from the Western Passage with observations. Those observations enter the harbour's conversation. A storyteller hears the conversation and folds it into a tale that already has an audience. The tale gets told 3 towns inland and 30 years later. By then the specific current has become a creature, and the creature has a name, and the name has a set of ritual behaviours that actually, if you know how to read the encoding, tells you something about the water. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is intelligence in a form suited to the available tools. The high Brazil that appeared on those Atlantic maps, that island west of Ireland that cartographers kept marking with confident precision despite nobody agreeing on its exact location, was neither pure fiction nor pure sighting. It was the coastline of sailors' genuine uncertainty, made permanent ink on vellum. Something was out there. People had seen something. The fog had broken at the right moment and there had been a shape, or what seemed like a shape. That observation passed through enough mouths became Hebrasil, which became a point on a map, which gave later sailors something to aim for and fail to find, which reinforced the island's quality of elusiveness, which made the story stronger. The bard runs his thumb once across the strings, not quite a chord, not quite a melody. Every map is a record of where human knowledge ends, he says, and right at that edge, right there, at the margin where the measured coast gives way to the illustrated serpent, where the Portolan chart's careful rum lines dissolve into speculation, that is where legend lives. Not in ignorance, exactly. In the honest acknowledgement that the world is larger than any single account of it, and that the sea does not explain itself to anyone who asks. He looks toward the rain-dark window. So when the sailor in those voyage tales rows toward the fog and hears music before he sees the island, he's not making a mistake. He's following the only navigation available when the charts run out. And that, in the end, is what stories have always been for. He lets that settle for a moment. Then something shifts in his posture, a straightening, a gathering. And when he speaks again, his voice has picked up a different weight. Not the slow, ruminative quality of the sea in the maps. Something harder. Something with hoofbeats in it. Let me tell you about a queen, he says. She rides out of the east before dawn. Her horse is a steppe-bred animal, compact and deep-chested, bred for endurance across grasslands that stretch from the Black Sea to the edge of the world, you know. Across her back a composite bow. Not the simple longbow you might imagine, but a recurved weapon, layered from horn and sinew and wood, glued under heat and shaped to hold enormous tension. It can drive an arrow through bronze at 100 paces. At her hip, a short iron blade. On the horse's flank, her quiver holds 30, perhaps 40 bronze-tipped arrows, and each one has her mark. She does not need a man to carry her weapons. She's been carrying them since she was old enough to ride, which is to say since she was very small. She has no name in the bard's telling. That is the nature of legend. It strips away the specific and replaces it with the type. She becomes the warrior queen, the mounted terror from beyond the known horizon, the woman who rides where women, according to the men telling the tale, are not supposed to ride. But she had a name once. She had a kurgan. Here the bard pauses, and the word hangs in the fire-warmed air like something foreign and exact. A kurgan, a burial mound raised over the steppe, heaped earth over a timber chamber, sometimes over a stone-lined pit. The people of the Eurasian grasslands, Scythians, Sarmatians, the cultures that ranged across what is now Ukraine and southern Russia and Kazakhstan in the centuries before and after the Common Era began. They buried their dead this way, and what they buried with them tells us something extraordinary. When archaeologists began excavating those mounds in earnest, they expected a pattern that matched the world they already knew. Warriors in warriors' graves, women in something else. What they found was more complicated. A meaningful fraction of the graves containing weapons, the short swords, the quivers, the bronze arrowheads, the horse trappings, belonged to women. Estimates from Scythian and Sarmatian burial sites along the lower Don and Volga suggest something in the range of 1 in 5 warrior graves is biologically female, though scholars are quick to note the figures shift as new excavations come in and classification methods evolve. The point is not a precise percentage. The point is that it is not zero, and it is not rare, and these are not symbolic burials in any easy sense. The skeletons speak. Some of the women show the characteristic changes that come from years of riding. Altered bone structure in the hips and legs from hours spent on horseback. Some show stress patterns in the shoulders and arms consistent with repeated use of a heavy bow. A few carry injuries, arrowheads lodged in bone, fractures consistent with blade trauma. These are not women buried with weapons as a gesture. Some of them were, by the available evidence, doing the work. Some of those kurgans contained more. Gold ornaments, mirrors and combs, ritual objects whose meaning we can only guess at. One woman might be buried with a quiver and a carved wooden comb and a flask of some preserved substance and horse harness enough for 2 animals. The categories we bring to these graves, warrior or queen, fighter or priestess, keep collapsing. She may have been all of it at once. Clan leader, battle commander, ritual authority, whatever the steppe version of queen meant in a society that moved with the seasons and held its wealth in horses and gold and the memory of its dead. This is what the Greek storytellers were, in some oblique way, describing. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, placed the Amazons around the Black Sea coast. He knew the geography well enough to place them in proximity to actual steppe peoples. In his account, Amazons and Scythian young men eventually mingled and produced the Sarmatai, a people where, he claimed, women could not marry until they had killed an enemy in battle. Modern classicists will tell you this is almost certainly Greek projection, a fantasy about gender inversion that made the other peoples of the frontier simultaneously fascinating and morally legible as a warning. But the geography is not accidental. The Black Sea region was where Greek traders and colonists actually encountered steppe cultures. Something real was at the edge of what Herodotus was reaching for, even as his telling bent it into Greek narrative shapes. And this is what the bard understands, instinctively, without needing to read any of this in a book. He knows that a woman on horseback with a bow is a story that does particular work on a particular kind of audience. He watches the room right now. And yes, there is a shift. Something that is not quite discomfort and not quite admiration, but the place where those two things border each other. The warrior queen is not threatening in a way that maps cleanly onto a known enemy. She's threatening in the way a mirror is threatening. She reflects a question that the room has not agreed to ask. If she can ride and fight and lead and command burial rites and carry weapons and govern, then what exactly was the rule, and who decided it, and when? Male-dominated societies throughout history have found armed women fascinating for precisely this reason. They are not simply powerful. They are power in the wrong shape, according to the conventions of those societies, and that wrongness is generative. It produces stories. The Amazons appear on Greek pottery in numbers disproportionate to their actual role in the mythological tradition. Battle scenes between Greek heroes and mounted women archers, painted with a care that suggests the painter found them worth painting again and again. The same pattern repeats when European observers encountered the Agogi, the women's regiments of the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa, from the 17th century onward. The accounts are full of barely contained shock at their effectiveness and discipline. Something about the reality of it would not fit the frame men had prepared for it. The bard does not make his warrior queen a monster. That would be the easier choice, and he is too good a craftsman for it. He makes her comprehensible, which is stranger. She has reasons. She has a people to protect, a grazing territory to hold, an enemy pressing from the south who does not respect treaties. She rides because someone must, and she is the one who can. The audience in the hall finds itself slightly against its will, hoping she wins, and then he pulls back, just slightly, like a painter stepping away from a canvas. "Here is what I can tell you," he says, quieter now. "She is a legend, this queen. She may be a dozen real women collapsed into one. She may be a Greek merchant's tavern story, half remembered, mixed with an actual encounter at a steppe market. She may be the memory of a burial mound that someone opened and found unexpected. The named Amazons of myth, Hippolyta, Penthesilea, Antiope. They are literary figures, assembled by poets. But behind the poetry, somewhere in the kurgans, women were buried with their bows. Their bones still carry the record of what they did. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot." He lets the fire speak for a moment, and the room settles into something thoughtful. The queen rides on. She always does. The room is still holding her. You can feel it. That particular stillness that comes after a story lands somewhere deeper than entertainment. The bard reads it too. He has been reading rooms his whole life. He does not rush past it. "So," he says, almost to himself, almost to the fire, "what do we actually know?" It is the question good storytellers are obliged to ask, even when the asking costs them something, even when the mystery, left intact, would play better. The graves are real. That is where he begins, and it is the right place. Across the Eurasian steppe, that vast corridor of grassland running from the northern coast of the Black Sea through what is now southern Russia, Kazakhstan, and into Siberia, archaeologists have spent the better part of a century opening burial mounds and finding things that did not fit the expected picture. The most recent surveys of Scythian female burials in European Scythia alone count more than 300 graves where women were interred with weapons: bows and quivers, spears, iron swords, horse harness. 300 is not a rounding error. It is not a handful of ritual exceptions. It is a pattern. At Pokrovka, on the Russian steppe, excavations in the 1990s turned up young women buried with iron swords still at their sides, quivers loaded with bronze-tipped arrows, and the skeletal evidence of lives spent in the saddle. The bones tell their own story, separate from any Greek account, separate from any poet's agenda. Changed bone density in the hips and legs from years of riding. Stress patterns in shoulders and upper arms from the repeated draw of a heavy recurved bow. A few skeletons carrying old injuries, healed fractures, arrowheads embedded in bone, that suggest these women were not ceremonially armed after death as a symbolic gesture. Some of them had done the work. What the graves cannot tell us, and this is where the bard's voice takes on a note of careful honesty, is exactly what social role those women held in their own communities. Were warrior women a recognised institution, a regular part of steppe military life, or were they exceptional individuals, daughters of chieftains, women whose circumstances demanded they take up arms, women of unusual prowess who earned a particular burial through particular deeds? Archaeologists debate this actively, and the debate is not settled. The graves establish that some steppe women fought, or were honoured as fighters, or occupied a role that blended both. They do not establish a society of warrior women living apart from men, raiding Greek settlements, amputating one breast for better bowmanship. That part is something else. That part is what happens to real, complicated people when a story crosses a sea and passes through a poet's hands. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, placed the Amazons near the Black Sea coast, the same frontier zone where Greek traders, colonists and travellers actually came into contact with steppe cultures. He even offers a word for them from Scythian sources, Oiopata, which he translates as man-killers. He tells a story of Amazons eventually intermarrying with Scythian men and founding a new people, the Sauramatians, where women could not marry until they had killed in battle. Modern classicists treat this with considerable caution. It is almost certainly Greek projection, a fantasy of gender inversion constructed around an encounter with peoples whose actual social arrangements were simply different from Greek norms. But the Black Sea geography is not accidental. Something real was at the edge of what Herodotus was reaching toward. The direction of his imagination was not random. What seems to have happened, and this is interpretation not certainty, the bard would be the first to say so, is that Greek travellers encountered steppe cultures where women's roles were substantially different from their own. In a nomadic pastoralist society organised around horses and seasonal migration, a rigid division of labour between exclusively fighting men and exclusively domestic women may have been a luxury the steppe could not afford. Women rode, some women bore arms. When Greek eyes met this, they processed it through their own anxieties and categories, and produced something larger, cleaner, and more mythically useful. An entire civilization of warrior women, organised as a mirror inversion of the Greek polis, situated just at the edge of the known world where strange things were permitted to live. And then Athens took the story and sharpened it into a political tool. As Athenian power and self-image grew through the 5th century, Amazon stories became a recurring motif on pottery, in sculpture, in the decorative programs of public buildings. The Amazonomachy, the battle between Greek heroes and Amazon warriors, appeared on the Parthenon itself, carved alongside scenes of Greeks fighting Persians and Lapiths fighting centaurs. The message was not subtle. Athens against the barbarian, order against chaos, civilization against the threatening frontier beyond it. The Amazon served as a mythic category for everything the Athenian imagination placed outside the walls of the properly ordered city. Female authority, non-Greek custom, armed power in the hands of those who are supposed to be subordinate. The story exaggerates difference because it needs to. That is what frontier mythology does. You cannot define civilization without a wild edge to define it against, and the wild edge must be extreme enough to make the centre feel justified. So the women who rode and sometimes fought become women who exclusively fight. The steppe society, where gender roles were simply less rigid, becomes an all-female nation without men at all. The real is taken and stretched until it serves the ideological shape the telling requires. This is not a flaw in Greek storytelling. It is how storytelling functions, and here the bard pauses because he knows he is inditing his own trade. There is no single true version of the Amazon story. Herodotus tells it one way. Homer mentions Amazons in the Iliad briefly, as a people Bellerophon once fought. Later poets elaborate, contradict, and invent. Different cities claim different Amazon episodes as their own founding myths. The tradition is not a unified record. It is a collection of competing tellings, each shaped by what its teller needed the story to do at a particular moment for a particular audience. Treat any one source as the definitive account and you will misread all of them. The right approach is to hold them together loosely and look for the patterns underneath. What those patterns reveal is a story that has survived not because it is history, but because it sits precisely at the crossroads of things people find irresistible. Real archaeology, women in kurgans, bones that show years of riding, arrows still in quivers, gives the legend plausibility. The feminist reading of those graves, the interest in strong women whose lives archaeology is slowly uncovering, gives it contemporary energy. And the Greek invention, the way the tale was shaped into something mythically extreme and visually dramatic, gives it staying power in the imagination. The combination is almost perfectly designed for modern audiences who, not entirely unlike ancient ones, want both the marvel and the kernel of truth beneath it. The bard glances around the room. He has not lost them. If anything, they are leaning in more than before. The way people lean when something they thought was pure fantasy reveals a floor of actual ground beneath it. He knows this is the craft. Not the invention of marvels out of nothing, but the selection and arrangement of real human experience. The women on the step, the bones in the earth, the Greek painter who spent hours perfecting the arc of a drawn bow on red figure pottery, into a shape the room can feel all at once. He knows that the warrior queen is most powerful not when she's entirely impossible, but when she is almost possible. Almost someone who left a mark that a careful eye can still find if it knows where to look. He reaches for his cup. His eyes move across the faces nearest the fire, the ones who have travelled farthest into the tale with him. Every good legend, he says quietly, has bones somewhere underneath it. He lets that sit. Then he looks up towards something beyond the rafters, and when he speaks again, his voice has taken on a different register, older, slower, as though he is reaching back past the steppe and the Greeks and the Kurgans to something older than any of them. There was a night, he says, when the sky itself broke open. There was a night, he says again, and this time the words fall differently. Not like an invitation, but like a warning. He does not set the story in any one land. That is deliberate. The song he sings next has no single home, and he knows it. And part of what makes it worth singing is exactly that. You know the fear, he says, and he is looking at the ones nearest the door, the ones who came in shaking water from their cloaks, who checked the sky before they crossed the threshold tonight. Any of you who have worked close to water, any of you who have watched a river in the wrong season, or stood on a headland when the wind changed in a way it should not have changed. You know the specific feeling of weather that has gone beyond weather, when the sky stops being a ceiling and becomes something else entirely, something with intent. He holds the note of that. The song begins low, almost spoken, a harbour, a community that has built itself around the shore because that is where the living is, where the fish run and the trade comes in, and the boats rest at evening with their hulls dark against the water. Children who can name every boat by sight. Families whose whole lives are organised around the reliable grammar of tides. Then something shifts. The water does not come in at the expected hour. When it comes wrong. Not the usual slope and push of tide, but something heavier. Something that does not stop. He sings of a woman who notices first. Not a prophet, not a king. A woman who has been mending nets since first light, and who looks up because the sound the water makes against the dock pilings has changed. A note lower, a rhythm off by a fraction. She has heard that sound 10,000 mornings, and she knows it has never sounded like this. She calls to her husband. He does not believe her immediately, because why would he? The sky's still there. The sun is still where it should be. The boats are fine. Then the boats are not fine. The bard's voice does not dramatize this with noise. He does it quietly, which is worse. He describes the water rising past familiar marks. The post where the children measure themselves each year. The step of the chandler's shop that has been dry since anyone can remember. He describes the last lights visible on the far shore as the evening comes in, growing fewer, going dark. Not enemies, not catastrophe in the shape of armies or fire, just water, patient and absolute, filling in the spaces where a world used to be. There is a particular cruelty to flood, he says, stepping briefly out of the song. It does not destroy your things. It simply takes them somewhere you cannot follow. The house is still there, somewhere beneath the new surface, the table with the carved leg, the threshold stone, all of it intact and unreachable, and the water above it looks the same as any water anywhere. He sings of what is carried and what is left. A boat overloaded. The impossible arithmetic of what you can bring when there is not enough room for everyone. He does not linger on this. He does not have to. Every person in the tavern who has ever loved anyone understands the arithmetic immediately, and the bard trusts his audience. Now he draws back and his voice shifts again. The aside, the gentle frame. This is not one story, he says. This is every story. or close enough that the difference starts to matter less the longer you think about it. The oldest version of this tale that was written down, truly written down, in clay, in a script most people in this room will never have seen, comes from Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, far to the east and south, where the great civilizations built their first cities in the flat land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. A man whose name in one telling is Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise, receives a warning from a god who should not be warning him. He builds a boat. He loads it past all sensible capacity with family and animals and whatever can be saved. The storm that follows lasts 7 days and 7 nights, and when it ends, the world that existed before it is gone. Another version of the same tale is buried inside the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest extended stories ever written, where the survivor is called Utnapishtim, and the flood is so total that even the gods who sent it are terrified by what they have done. They crouch at the walls of heaven, the text says, like dogs. Even divine power, it turns out, cannot watch its own consequences from a comfortable distance. The Greeks had it too. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, warned by Prometheus, floating in a chest while Zeus drains the world of the people whose impiety had exhausted his patience. 9 days on the water, then a mountain peak appearing. Then, in the strange, beautiful logic of myth, the couple repopulating the earth by casting stones over their shoulders, the bones of the earth, they are told, which become people, the world built again from its own deep material, different names, different gods, different reasons given for divine anger. But the structure is the same, and its emotional architecture is the same, and the bard thinks that is not coincidence. What it might actually be, he says carefully, because he was trained to be honest even when honesty complicates things. What it might actually be is memory. The kind of memory that runs deeper than individual lifetimes. It is possible, and some scholars have argued it carefully, that flood stories in various traditions encode something real. The end of the last great ice age, when the world's coastlines changed dramatically as the ice melted and the sea level rose, entire landscapes vanished beneath the water over the course of centuries, or sometimes faster. Harbours drowned, valleys flooded. Communities that had existed on land that was now the seafloor found themselves displaced, carrying the shape of what they had lost in stories that got told again and told again for generations beyond counting. There are oral traditions from cultures on the other side of the world, traditions that scholars have only recently examined against geological data, where stories of the sea rising over land correspond with striking specificity to reconstructions of coastlines from thousands of years ago. Thousands of years! The names of the families in those boats have not survived. The names of the harbours have not survived. But something survived. The terror did. The shape of the loss did. Because that is what human beings do with unbearable experience. They fold it into story. They hand it to their children, and their children hand it onward, and eventually the details blur and the gods get involved and the moral gets attached. Because moral meaning is how a community survives, not just the water, but the memory of the water. And here the flood story picks up its other function. Because the reset must mean something. The world after the flood cannot simply be the world before the flood with the people washed off. The gods who sent it are in some traditions ashamed. They make covenants. They promise limits. They look at the survivors and recalibrate. The flood becomes not just an ending but a hinge, the moment after which a different arrangement between the human and the divine becomes possible. Every culture that built a deluge story into its founding myths was building in some sense a claim that the people telling the story are the ones who came through, that they are the remnant worth saving, that their world, this world, is the world after the flood, and therefore the world as it is supposed to be. The bard lets the song trail to stillness. The names go, he says simply. The specific families, the particular harbour, the faces on the boats, all of it goes eventually. But the shape of it, the water rising past the marks that should have held, the last light going out on the far shore, that endures. Somehow that endures. He looks at the fire, because some things, he says, are too large to be forgotten. They simply wait to be retold. He is quiet for a moment after that, long enough that someone near the back shifts on their bench, and the fire settles with a sound like a long exhale. Then he says, But what does it actually mean to remember something you were not alive to see? Not you specifically, not any single person. He means a community, a line of people handing something fragile forward across time. Not a document, not a carved stone, not a map. Something far less stable than any of those. Words, a tune. The specific cadence of a story that has been told so many times its grooves are worn smooth, the way a doorstep stone wears smooth from a century of crossing. Here is what makes the flood stories remarkable, he says, and leans forward slightly, elbows on knees. Not that they exist, not even that they are so widespread, though they are. Mesopotamia, Greece, ancient India, China, the Pacific coast, the Amazon basin, West Africa. What makes them remarkable is that in at least some cases, the earth itself seems to agree with them. He means this precisely. There is a place, or there was a place, depending on how you measure time, between the eastern coast of what people now call England and the western coast of what they call the Low Countries. A plain, low-lying, threaded with rivers, covered in forest and marsh, and the kinds of slow water where fish gather in impossible numbers. People lived there, not a few but many, over many generations during the long centuries after the last great ice age, when the world was still redistributing itself, still finding its new level as the ice melted and the sea slowly rose. Flint tools have been pulled from the seafloor, harpoons. The bones of animals hunted by people whose names were never written because writing did not yet exist. The land has a name now. Scholars call it Doggerland for the sandbar that is its highest ghost. But when people lived on it, it was simply home. And then the sea took it. Gradually at first, over centuries, the rising water narrowing the plain, shrinking the forest, salting the marsh. Then, around 6,000 years before our own era, something more sudden. A vast underwater landslide off the coast of what is now Norway sent a wave across the North Sea that struck the low coast and pushed inland and left, in the layers of sediment that geologists can read today, a clear line. Here was the world before, here was the world after. The people on that plain did not vanish instantly. They moved, they climbed. They told their children what had been lost. Whether any thread of that telling connects to any story still in circulation is genuinely unknown. The honest answer is we cannot trace it. But the shape of the loss is there in the ground, and it is the exact shape of the stories. And Doggerland is not alone in this. In China, the myth of Gunyu, the great flood that swallowed the land for generations, the heroic labour of diverting and controlling the waters, carries within it a memory that geology has started to corroborate. A massive outburst flood at a place called Jishi Gorge on the Yellow River, dated to roughly 1920 BCE, appears to have been among the largest floods of the last 10,000 years. A natural dam collapse, a catastrophic wall of water downstream, a landscape reorganized in hours. Whether that specific event is the event behind the myth, whether the centuries between the flood and the earliest written accounts of Gunyu preserved it faithfully or blurred it beyond recognition, no one can say with certainty. But the direction the evidence points is interesting enough to sit with. The bard pauses, and when he speaks again his tone is careful. He is not claiming that every flood story maps to a specific disaster. That would be the wrong kind of honesty, the kind that sounds precise but overreaches. What archaeology and geology can do is demonstrate that the category of experience the stories describe was real, was recurrent, and was in some cases vast enough to justify the scale of the telling. They can light the room without reading every word in it. Because myths do not need to be literal records to preserve something true. A story that has passed through 40 generations of telling has been reshaped by every pair of hands that held it, simplified here, elaborated there, a god inserted to make sense of the inexplicable, a covenant added because the community needed to believe the catastrophe had a purpose. What arrives at the far end of that chain is not a transcript, it is something more like a scar. The body's record of injury, transformed by healing into a different kind of tissue, but still carrying the information that something happened here, and it was serious. The oral culture of this room works the same way, he says, and gestures, not grandly, just a small motion at the walls around them. Someone heard a story last month from a carter who passed through from the north. That carter had it from a woman at a ford 3 days' ride away, who had it from her grandmother. By the time it reaches this room tonight, The details have shifted. The name of the place has changed or been lost. The person at the centre of it has become slightly larger than life. The lesson has sharpened, because that is what happens to lessons in transit. They clarify or they calcify, but they rarely stay exactly as they were. And yet something in the story is true. Something in it was worth carrying all that way. He says, that is what a legend is. It is not a lie dressed up as history. It is not history pretending to be more than it is. It is a vessel, old, repaired many times, carrying water across a distance that would have destroyed any other container. You do not hold a vessel like that up to the light and complain that it is not a drinking glass. You ask what it was built to carry, and how far it has come, and what the people who built it were afraid of. With flood stories, the answer is not complicated. They were afraid of the water. They were afraid of the specific terror of a world that had seemed stable, revealing itself as anything but. They were afraid for their children, who would have to rebuild. And they were afraid that the experience, the loss, the scale of it, the way it reorganized everything they understood, would be forgotten. That the dead would be forgotten. That the harbour would be forgotten. That the world under the water would simply stop existing in any sense that mattered. So they built the vessel, they told the story, they handed it forward, and here it is, still here, still being carried. He straightens, and something in his posture shifts, the contemplative quality settling, a new thread picking up beneath his hands. Water, he says quietly, takes what it takes and does not explain itself. That is the nature of it. But the things it swallows do not always vanish completely. Sometimes they leave a shape behind, a hollow in the sediment, a silhouette in the story, a name that has survived everything except the place it named. There are cities in these tales, he says, not coastlines, not plains, cities, built things, planned things, the deliberate work of organized minds, that the stories claim the water or the earth or time itself simply erased. Whether any of them existed, whether what the stories describe and what the ground contains are the same conversation or two different ones. That is the question the next telling raises. He runs his thumb across the strings once softly, testing the pitch. The water remembers, he says, even if we have to learn its language to hear what it is saying. He lets that image settle, the water remembering the language of sediment and flood, and then he begins to play something slow and deliberate, a melody that has the quality of something being built rather than recalled, stone by stone, level by level. There is a city, he says. The room listens. There is a city at the bottom of the sea. It has harbours on the outside and rings of water on the inside, because the men who built it loved symmetry the way men with too much time and too much wealth often do. The outer walls are faced with bronze that catches the dawn and throws it back at the sky. The inner sanctum, and there is always an inner sanctum in cities like this, is plated with something rarer, something that glows like fire even at night, a metal the builders called orichalcum, which may have been real and is now lost, or may have been imaginary and was never found, depending on which scholar you ask and in what mood. The temple at the centre is dedicated to a god who loved the sea, because the sea made the city possible, and because it is always wise to honour the thing that can destroy you. The markets smell of salt and spice and the kind of money that has been changing hands so long, it has worn smooth and bears no face. Ships come from every direction. The harbour entrance is wide enough for 3 vessels abreast. The towers along the outer ring are tall enough that the sentinels can see a storm coming from half a day away, which turns out in the end to matter very little. A man at the table nearest the barge shifts, half smiling. Sounds like a rich man's story, he says. Everything perfect, everything plenty. The bard inclines his head. It always is, he says. That is part of how you know it. Because the city, this particular telling of this particular city, comes from a man named Plato, writing in Athens roughly 4 centuries before the Common Era, in a pair of dialogues he called the Timaeus and the Critias. He gave the city a name, Atlantis. He said it was told to a Greek statesman by an Egyptian priest, which is already 2 removes from any source you can put your hands on, and the Egyptian priest said it had happened 9,000 years before his own time, which puts it so deep in prehistory that no written record could possibly confirm it. Plato, who was one of the finest philosophical minds his age produced, was also perfectly capable of constructing an elaborate fictional setting to make a point. He had done it before. He would do it again. What was the point? The bard pauses, and someone on the far bench, a woman who's been listening quietly since the flood story, asks it aloud before he can answer himself. What did he need the city for? He needed it to fall, the bard says. That is the mechanism. Atlantis in Plato's telling begins virtuous, a society of people with divine heritage and clear purpose, prosperous without being corrupt. Then, as generations pass and the divine blood thins and the wealth thickens, something curdles. Pride. Overreach. The city turns acquisitive in the way that empires turn acquisitive, reaching outward, pressing against neighbours, eventually pressing against a virtuously governed Athens in a war that Athens, Plato's Athens, idealized everything Plato wished it were, wins. And then, as though the world itself passes judgment on the aggressor, the earthquakes come, the floods come, in a single day and a single night. The whole of it goes under. The man who said it sounded like a rich man's story grunts quietly. So it is a lesson. It is dressed as one, the bard says. Whether that is all it is, that is where it gets interesting, because Plato did not invent the category. He invented, or refined, or borrowed and elaborated, the specific geography, the concentric rings, the bronze-clad walls. But stories of prosperous coastal cities swallowed by the sea were older than he was and considerably wider than Greece. In the waters off the Breton coast there is the city of Ease, built below the high tide line on land drained and defended by great gates, ruled by a king whose daughter opened those gates to a stranger she loved, or a devil she mistook for one, depending on the version. The sea came in. The king rode out on horseback ahead of the wave, and the city was gone. Off the coast of Wales there is Cantrea Gwaelod, the lowland 100, a fertile plain of 16 cities beneath what is now Cardigan Bay, protected by an embankment and lost to negligence at the sluice gates one careless or drunken night. Today, at low tide, you can sometimes see the dark lines of ancient tree stumps stretching out into the bay, submerged forests. Something was, once, where the water is now, and there, the older man from the back of the room, who has been sceptical all night, says, "So the forests are real, the stumps are real. Does that mean the cities were real?" The bard shakes his head slowly. Not necessarily. What the stumps mean is that the sea rose, which it did steadily as the ice of the last great cold retreated, and sharply in certain moments, as when a landslide off the Norwegian shelf sent a wave across the North Sea 6,000 or 7,000 years ago and reshaped the coastline in an afternoon. People lived on those low plains before the water came. They lost what they had built, and they remembered the loss, and the memory moved inland with them and collected over generations the grammar of story. The gates left open, the pride before the fall, the god who was offended or the king who was warned and did not listen. Whether there were actual towers in Cardigan Bay or actual bronze gates in the Bay of Biscay is a different question from whether people experienced catastrophic coastal loss and needed to explain it to their children. The second thing almost certainly happened. The first is speculation. There is a young man at the table near the window who's been arguing softly with the person beside him. He speaks up now, but people keep looking for it. Atlantis. They keep sending ships and divers and machines down to look. They do, the bard agrees. The island of Thera, now Santorini, destroyed by one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the Bronze Age, sometime in the 17th century before the Common Era, though the exact date is still argued, wiped out Minoan harbour towns and sent tsunamis across the eastern Mediterranean. That is real. That happened. Whether Plato knew of it, or whether it filtered into Greek memory as a story and contributed material to what he built, is genuinely unresolved. Most scholars who study him closely are skeptical that he was describing anything other than what he said he was describing. A moral fable. The city is too perfect in its symmetry, too neat in its fall, too conveniently useful to Plato's philosophical argument for it to sit comfortably as history. Which does not make it unimportant. The bard's voice is careful here, precise. A story that people have been retelling, relocating, arguing about and sailing toward for 2,500 years is not nothing. It is in fact a mirror, and what it reflects is not a drowned city, it is us. Every generation that reaches for Atlantis is reaching for something. Proof that advanced knowledge has existed and been lost, relief that the arrogant were punished, longing for a time before whatever present feels like decline, anxiety about the coastlines of their own era. The legend tells you almost nothing certain about the Bronze Age. It tells you everything about what the people holding it needed to believe. The woman who asked the question earlier speaks again. So we built the city ourselves. In a manner of speaking, the bard says, every generation laid a course of stone. Plato built the moral skeleton. Later writers added continents and sunken pillars. Romanticism added the golden age of wisdom and science, all the things the present seem to lack. And now, in an age when the seas are genuinely measurably rising again, the story has acquired an edge it may not have had since it was first told. The fear is not purely metaphorical anymore. The room is quiet for a moment with that. He plays a few bars of the same slow, building melody, and then lets it descend, note by note, into something lower, something that sounds like settling, like the long silence of deep water, the city sinking through sound. What we bury in stories, he says softly, we're always also trying to find. The question is whether we are excavating truth or excavating need, and whether in the end the honest answer is both. He sits with that silence for a moment, then sets the melody aside entirely. No song for this, he says. What comes next deserves plain speech, because there is something worth saying about how all of it, Arthur, the Isle, the warrior queens, the flood, the sunken city, actually reaches you. Not the stories themselves, the mechanism, the hands it passed through, the things those hands changed, sometimes without meaning to, sometimes with great and deliberate intention. You might imagine a legend as something like a stone, fixed, old, finished, dropped into the past and sitting there, waiting to be found. But that is not what a legend is, never has been. A legend is more like a fire passed from torch to torch across a very dark field, and what you have to ask yourself at any given moment is how many hands have held that torch, and how far each of them ran, and whether they were running towards something or away from it. Here is what actually happens. A thing occurs, a battle, a flood, a remarkable person, a vanished place. People who were close to it tell others, those others tell their children. Somewhere in that chain, a skilled singer takes hold of the story because skilled singers are the ones who decide what survives and what dissolves. They shape it for the room they are performing in, for the king who is paying them, for the crowd that needs to feel something particular that night. They are not lying exactly, but they are not transcribing either. They are making. Then a writer copies it down, or a chronicler borrows it, or a court poet refashions it with the concerns of a new dynasty in mind. Each Geoffrey of Monmouth who sits at a desk and transforms scattered Welsh material into a glittering Arthurian court is doing something real, creating, genuinely creating, while also claiming, always claiming, that he is only reporting what is true and ancient and authoritative. The claim of ancientness is itself a tool. It says, this is not my opinion, this is what was, and you cannot argue with what was. The bard leans back in his chair, and there is something in his expression that is not quite a smile, and then the romantics get involved. In 1760, which is not ancient, which is not even particularly old, which is the age of wigs and drawing rooms and a very specific kind of melancholy that was fashionable in Edinburgh, a Scottish scholar named James Macpherson published what he described as translations from a 3rd century Gaelic bard called Ossian. The poems were striking, windswept, full of Highland mist and fallen heroes and a noble grief that felt, to the people who read them in their candlelit parlours, like touching something enormous and primordial and lost. They became a sensation across Europe. Napoleon carried them on campaign. Goethe admired them. They were received as the Northern Homer, proof that the Celtic world had its own deep heroic scripture, its own bardic antiquity to set beside Greece and Rome. There was a problem. Samuel Johnson, who was not a man inclined toward politeness when he smelled a fraud, immediately asked Macpherson to produce his original Gaelic manuscripts. Macpherson's answers were evasive. They remained evasive. The Highland Society eventually conducted a formal inquiry in the early 19th century and found something complicated. Yes, there were genuine Gaelic fragments, oral traditions, scraps of manuscript, real material that Macpherson had collected in the Highlands, but the long unified epics, the sweeping narratives presented as Ossian's complete works, had no originals that anyone could locate. What Macpherson had done, it appears, was gather the fragments, rearrange them, expand them heavily, fill the gaps with his own very 18th century prose poetry, and then present the whole construction as a recovered ancient voice, not pure forgery, not honest translation, something in between, which is actually harder to argue against than pure forgery and more dangerous in its influence. Because here is what Ossian did. It told people what they needed to hear. It gave Scotland, and the broader Celtic world, a heroic antiquity that matched the political and cultural pressures of the moment. Romantic nationalism was looking for exactly this kind of thing, all across Europe. Every emerging national identity wanted its own primordial epic, its own proof that its people had always been noble and deep-rooted and distinct. Ossian was so useful, so perfectly shaped for that hunger, that its emotional truth overwhelmed its textual problems. People believed it not because the evidence compelled them, but because the belief was satisfying. The historian Eric Hobsbawm would later call this kind of thing an invented tradition, a modern creation draped in old clothes to produce a feeling of deep, unbroken continuity. Ossian is perhaps the most famous example. It is not the only one. And this is where the bard pauses and something shifts in his voice. He is not exempt from this. That's what he wants you to understand. Every time he sits in a room like this one and tells you about Arthur or the flood or the sunken city, he is making choices. He is choosing which version. He is choosing which detail to linger on. He is choosing the melody that goes underneath, the pause that lands before the important word, the note of uncertainty that makes the scholarly aside feel like depth rather than equivocation. He has inherited these stories, yes, but inheritance is not passive. You do something with what you inherit. You're always, even in the most faithful retelling, putting your hands on it. A messenger who shapes the message is also in some measure a maker. What is interesting, and the bard says this carefully because it matters, is that oral and written traditions do not exist in separate channels. They have always contaminated each other, which is not the right word, but it is the honest one. Macpherson collected oral tradition and printed it. Once printed, his versions fed back into what Highland singers performed, because singers encountered the printed text and absorbed it, and the fashionable written version gradually displaced or reshaped the older sung ones. This is not unique to the Ossian case. It happens whenever writing enters a culture that has been primarily oral, and it keeps happening in reverse whenever an oral performance revitalizes a text that had grown dusty on a page. The songs change the books change the songs. What comes out of the other end is not purely ancient and not purely invented. It is alive. That is the word he wants. Alive. Fossils do not grow. Fossils do not absorb the anxieties of a new century, or the grief of a new war, or the longing of a generation that feels it has lost something it cannot name. Fossils are finished. Legends are not finished. Legends metabolize. They take in what the culture around them is feeling, and they grow new chambers for it, new corridors, new rooms where the fear can sit down and be named without being confessed. That is not corruption. That is function. That is what stories are for. The danger is not that stories change. The danger is pretending they have not. The danger is Macpherson presenting his own creation as an untouched relic, stripping away the evidence of his own hands. Because when you hide the making, you also hide the meaning. You foreclose the real question, which is not only what is ancient, but what is needed. Why this story, in this form, right now, told to this room, matters. He looks around the tavern. The fire is lower now. The candles at the far tables have burned short. Every story you've heard tonight has been held by many hands before mine, he says. I have held it in mine for a while. What you do with it from here, that is the next set of hands. So let us follow those hands, not metaphorically this time, actually follow them, back to where the chain begins, or as close to the beginning as we can reach before the record goes dark, somewhere in ancient Greece, before the texts were fixed, before the scholars in Alexandria had compiled and argued over the canonical versions. There were men who walked from festival to festival, carrying long staffs and a vast store of memorized verse. They were called rhapsodes. The word is usually translated as something like song stitchers, and that translation is doing real work. They were not simply recalling, they were assembling, taking the inherited material of the Trojan cycle, the wanderings of Odysseus, the wrath of Achilles, and stitching the episodes together into whatever sequence suited the occasion, the audience, the particular competition they were entering that day. A Homeric recitation at a religious festival in Athens might foreground different passages than the same material performed at a symposium in Corinth. The staff was part of it, a prop, a signal of authority, a way of marking the rhapsode as the vessel through which something older and larger was speaking. But the rhapsode was also making choices. He was always making choices. We cannot be entirely certain how much of what he performed was fixed, and how much was fluid. That question has generated centuries of scholarly disagreement, and will probably never be fully resolved. But what we can say is that the Iliad and the Odyssey as we have them now are almost certainly the crystallized forms of a long tradition of live performance, in which individual singers shaped the material according to their skills, their audiences, and the conventions of their craft. The stories survived not because someone locked them in a vault, but because someone kept finding a room that needed them, moved forward several centuries, moved north and west. You find analogous figures in Celtic Ireland and Britain, the Ollum in Irish tradition, who occupied a rank at court roughly equivalent to a bishop, expected to memorize enormous volumes of genealogy, law and praise poetry, and to deploy them with surgical precision. You find Welsh bards competing in festivals, predecessors of the Eisteddfod traditions, where their skill in complex syllabic verse was the measure of their standing. You find Norse schools composing intricate court poetry, so technically demanding that modern scholars still argue about the meaning of individual kennings. These were not folk singers in the casual sense, they were specialists. They held a function that their societies regarded as genuinely necessary. Not entertainment in the modern sense of optional leisure, but a kind of social technology for storing and transmitting what mattered. And then you find them moving. The court bard had a fixed patron. But there were also minstrels and troubadours and jongleurs who moved between courts and markets and inns. Itinerant performers carrying their repertoire from settlement to settlement, offering news and satire and narrative to whoever would feed them and give them a corner near the fire. Medieval taverns and inns were natural performance spaces for these wandering figures. You come in off the road wet and tired. You sit down. Someone in the corner has a lute and a story about a famous battle or a mysterious disappearance. And the whole room leans in because there is no other way to learn what happened 50 miles away. Information and entertainment were not separate. The storyteller was the news, that figure, the traveller who comes in with a firelit instrument and a head full of borrowed material, who reads the room and chooses what to offer, is a real historical figure. Composite, yes, blurring Greek, Celtic, Norse, French, and English traditions into one convenient shape, yes, but not invented, not purely a fantasy, and yet. If you have ever played a tabletop role-playing game, the bard you have met at the table is a somewhat different creature. The Dungeons & Dragons bard, formalized as a standard character class in the second edition of Advanced D&D, though present in rough form earlier, is a conscious fusion of those historical threads with something new. Celtic poet, Norse skald, medieval minstrel, wandering rogue, and then a dash of actual magic. Music that heals wounds, inspires allies, terrifies enemies, bends the minds of kings. The bardic inspiration mechanic, the jack-of-all-trades flexibility, the charisma-based spell casting. None of this maps onto what an Irish ollum or a Greek rhapsode actually did. Historical bards were formidable. Their satire could reportedly blister a king's reputation for generations. Their genealogical knowledge was a form of political power. But they were not casting spells with a lute solo. The distinction is worth making, not to diminish what the game created, but to appreciate it more clearly. The D&D bard is a new synthesis. It took the cultural memory of a figure who carried stories through the world and asked, what if that figure were also a hero? What if the power that stories obviously do have in real life, the power to move people, to change behaviour, to sustain identity across centuries, were translated into literal magical force? That is not misunderstanding history. That is mythologizing it, which is, as it happens, exactly what bards themselves did with the material they inherited. And from there, the chain extends to something even newer and stranger. Since roughly the 2010s, a corner of YouTube and streaming culture has been building a virtual equivalent of this room. Fantasy tavern ambience videos, bardcore arrangements of modern pop songs reworked into lute and viol medieval style, crackling fires and murmured background chatter looped for hours to accompany studying, gaming, sleeping. The musical content borrows loosely from medieval and folk idioms, but is largely modern cinematic and game-inspired composition, the aesthetic of the tavern, the emotional texture of a candlelit common room, rendered in digital audio and offered to anyone in the world with headphones. Millions of people have found their way to this particular kind of imagined space. That is not trivial. What those listeners are doing is what every audience has always done in front of a performer, using the story space to become, temporarily, someone who lives in a world with more texture and weight and magic than ordinary life seems to allow. The Rhapsode's audience at the Panathenaic Festival wanted to feel the Trojan wind. The court that listened to a skald wanted to feel heroic ancestry, moving through the room like a current. The person with headphones and a browser tab open to a crackling fire playlist wants to feel, maybe just for an hour, that the world has depth and shadow and old songs in it. The mechanism is different. The hunger is the same. What each era does is remix. The Rhapsodes took older oral material and stitched it into new sequences for new occasions. Medieval singers retexted inherited melodies with topical words and local colour. The Romantics dressed up more recent compositions in ancient-sounding robes. Game designers took cultural memory and turned it into a playable archetype. Ambience creators looped the feeling of a thing that most of them have never experienced into a digital space they share with strangers across every time zone. At each step, something is added. Something is inevitably lost. And the result is neither the original nor a forgery. It is a living form. The failure would be to stop. The failure would be a tradition so committed to exact preservation that no new room could hold it. No new listener could find a way in. Legends endure precisely because they are willing to be changed by whoever is doing the carrying. The torch stays lit because someone keeps running. And tonight, wherever you are sitting, whatever version of this room you have built around yourself, you are the newest patron in a hall that has been full for a very long time. The chain does not end here. It runs through you. What you remember of this, what you carry forward, what you hand to someone else in whatever form suits the room you happen to be in, that is not an imitation of the tradition. That is the tradition. The fire has burned down to its deepest red. Not out, not yet, but lower now, the kind of heat that settles into your bones rather than throwing light across the room. Benches that were crowded an hour ago have thinned. A few people have drifted toward the stairs, or out through the heavy door into whatever night is waiting for them. The ones who remain are the ones who cannot quite bring themselves to leave. You know the feeling. You're still here, and so is he. The bard has been moving through the room for the last little while, not performing in the formal sense, not standing at the centre of attention demanding it, but circulating the way a good host does, pausing at this table and that one, letting the harp rest against his hip rather than raising it. This is a different kind of presence than the one he wore at the beginning of the night. Earlier there was a performance. Now there is something closer to a conversation, or the tail end of one, the kind that happens when the official occasion is over and people stop being careful about what they say. He stops near the far wall, where a candle has burned itself nearly to nothing in its holder, and he sets his fingers lightly against the strings without quite playing, a chord that is more intention than sound, and then he speaks, quieter than before. He says, "Think about what we have been doing tonight," not as a question, as an invitation to notice. We took a half-remembered king from a violent, fragmentary century in post-Roman Britain, and we dressed him in a castle and a round table, and a code of chivalry that did not yet exist when he supposedly lived. We followed sailors across a dark sea toward an island that may have been Ireland, or Scotland, or the coast of Wales, or nothing but the mind's appetite for a place where the usual rules do not apply. We rode with women warriors whose existence the ancient world argued about, and whose reality archaeology is still slowly, carefully confirming. Scythian graves on the Eurasian steppe, iron arrowheads, bent leg bones from a lifetime on horseback. We stood at the edge of a flood so vast that the memory of it crossed into a dozen different traditions and stayed there for thousands of years. We looked for a city under water and found something stranger and more interesting. The human habit of placing the best of what we once had just out of reach, just below the surface, so we have a reason to keep looking. None of those stories were simply invented. None of them were simply true. They were built, the way anything built to last is built, out of real material, shaped by real hands for real purposes, and then passed forward into the care of people who changed them to suit the rooms they were working in. A volcanic eruption becomes the anger of a god. A catastrophic flood becomes a divine test. A culture of mounted archers on the Pontic steppe becomes a race of warrior women who live at the edge of the known world. The shape changes. The pressure that created the shape does not. Anthropologists who study how communities respond to disaster have noticed something consistent and strange. After the immediate crisis passes, the story of it does not fade. It transforms. Volcanic communities in particular seem to develop mythic traditions that encode the danger in a form that can be taught to children. Traditions that are emotionally vivid enough to survive for generations, long after the specific event has passed out of living memory. Indigenous oral traditions in Australia appear to carry accurate information about meteoritic impacts and coastal flooding events that happened thousands of years ago, not because someone made a deliberate decision to preserve the data, but because the story that grew around the event was strong enough and strange enough to survive being told again and again by people who no longer knew what it referred to. The correlation between any given story and any given event is often impossible to prove with certainty, but the pattern, danger becoming myth, becoming memory, becoming story, is hard to dismiss. We do not tell stories instead of remembering. We tell stories in order to remember and in order to hand the memory to someone who was not there. The bard lifts the harp properly now and plays something that does not quite resolve, a phrase that suggests a melody without committing to one, the kind of thing that keeps you leaning forward, waiting. The remaining candles throw long shadows across the ceiling, and here is the thing he has been circling all night, the thing underneath all the specific legends, the thing that does not belong to any one culture or century. We have always done this. Every human community we have any record of, and many whose records are only now being recovered or interpreted, has found ways to take what was dangerous and painful and turn it into a shape that could be carried, a flood into a covenant, a lost kingdom into a promise of return, a defeat into a prophecy, a vanished civilization into a warning. The transformation is not dishonesty. It is a kind of grief work, spread across generations, distributed into the mouths of singers so that no single person has to hold it alone. What the bardic traditions of medieval Ireland and Wales understood, practically institutionally, was that this work was important enough to organise around. The Irish ollum, the Welsh pensard, the Norse court skald, these were not decorative figures. They were the people a society trusted with the task of keeping the story coherent over time. And when the great Welsh Eisteddfodau reached their formal conclusions, when the bard who had best voiced the community's memory was chaired or crowned in ceremony, there was not merely a prize for craft, it was recognition that the work mattered, that the room needed what the singer had done. Of course, those traditions were romanticised later, heavily. James Macpherson gave the 18th century a Gaelic bard named Ossian, and a collection of epic poems that felt ancient and wild and emotionally overwhelming, and which he had largely written himself, or at best improved beyond recognition from fragmentary originals. The poems swept through Europe. They moved Napoleon. They shaped what the romantic imagination thought a bard was. Solitary, mournful, the soulful voice of a vanished people. It was legend-making about legend-making. A myth about how myths are made. Even that, in its strange recursive way, proves the point. The longing for an ancient voice, even when the ancient voice has to be forged to meet the longing, is itself a real and human thing. Truth and legend are rarely the same thing. They are also rarely opposites. More often they are in conversation, each one pulling the other toward a shape that can do the necessary work, carrying memory, building identity, making a space where loss can be acknowledged without being unbearable. The bard moves to the last occupied table, yours, and sets the harp down against the bench, not because he is done, but because the last songs of a hall are usually quieter than the first ones. He does not need the instrument to say what comes next. He says, "You came in tonight from somewhere. You're going back to somewhere. And whatever you carry with you when you go, whatever image stays, whatever question opened up, whatever half-remembered name from an ancient tradition surfaces unexpectedly in a week or a month and makes you want to look it up, that is not nothing. That is how it has always travelled. Not in books alone, not in archives. In the part of the mind that hears a story late at night, when the fire is low and the room is quiet and decides to hold on to it. The candles are almost gone. He reaches for the nearest one. A slow pinch of his fingers and the flame goes out. A thread of smoke rises and curls and disappears into the dark above the beams. He moves to the next, and the next, not hurrying, not making a ceremony of it, just doing what needs to be done at the end of a long night when the wax has nearly run to nothing, and the innkeeper stopped caring about the cost of light some time ago, simply because there was hardly any light left to cost. Each candle out is a small subtraction. The room becomes a different room, not worse, just older somehow, and more honest. The way faces look better by firelight than by anything brighter, because firelight is not trying to show you everything at once. When the last candle on your side of the room goes dark, he straightens and he looks, not at a particular person, but at the room as a whole, the way you look at something when you want to remember it. He says, "Thank you," just that at first. Then, "Thank you for staying." There is a difference, he means, between an audience and a room that has decided to be present. Audiences arrive, observe, and leave. A room that has decided to be present does something else. It participates in the story simply by holding still and listening, which sounds passive until you try it, until you notice how much effort it actually takes to let someone else's words matter to you, to follow a thread from a post-Roman British warlord all the way to a flooded valley at the edge of memory, and keep hold of it without letting go. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing to offer. He has done this, something like this in some form or other, in many rooms at many hours. Late enough that the practical people have gone to bed, and only the curious ones remain. And the curious ones are never all from the same place. They never have been, even in the actual medieval taverns that this room is loosely pretending to be. The travellers who lingered longest over the final songs were often the ones who had come the furthest, who had a little of that particular restlessness that long distances give you, the sense that the world is stranger and larger than any single story about it, and that another story might help. So tell him where you are. That question is genuine and it stands. Drop it in the comments. Where you are in the world tonight. What the clock says on your end. Whether it is the deep middle of the night or early morning, or a tired afternoon that you're using to pretend, briefly, that it is night. The time zones that make that question interesting only became standardized in the 19th century, when the railways demanded it. North American railroads synchronized their clocks on a single November day in 1883, a date some called the Day of Two Noons because certain towns had to live through noon twice to get their clocks aligned. Before that, every town kept its own solar time, which meant that travelling any meaningful distance meant arriving somewhere where the hour was slightly different from the one you had left. The world was more patchwork then, time-wise, but the stories moved across it anyway, passed hand to hand and mouth to mouth across every seam. Now time zones run from UTC -12 all the way to UTC +14, wrapping the whole globe in a grid that would have seemed like sorcery to the real builders of rooms like this one. And somewhere inside that grid, right now, there is someone in bright morning light watching this, and someone in the middle of the night watching the same thing, and they are, in the way that matters for the purposes of what we have been doing here, in the same tavern, sitting at the same table, listening to the same last song. If any of that meant something to you tonight, if one of the legends landed, if one of the questions about what history actually left behind made you want to go looking for more, leave a comment. Not as a transaction, not as an algorithm appeasing exercise, but because the bard at the end of the night genuinely wants to know what stayed with you. And if you want to be here the next time the fire is lit, subscribe so you hear about it when it is. That is the only ask, because there are more stories, there always have been. Somewhere in the still burning coals of this night, there is already the suggestion of another figure from a fragmentary century, another voyage toward an island that may or may not exist, another flood or siege or vanishing that lodged itself so deep in human memory that it turned into legend before anyone could stop it. Which one will be next is the question the bard leaves you with as he lifts his cloak from the hook by the door. The fire settles, the room breathes. Someone somewhere across the dark and the time zones is already wondering the same thing,